Brian, try and talk to me. All right, take your time. Take your time. Where's your phone, mate? Have you got any family I can ring? Take your time, right?
You're watching Totally True Crime.
Totally True Crime.
Today's case takes us to Sawnsea in Wales. In October 2000, 33-year-old Brian Whitelock was a heavy drinker. He would often meet up with his brother and their mutual friends to drink in each other's homes. On this autumn day, Brian had gone round to his brother's house. His brother was Glenn Whitelock. They were also joined by Glenn's friend, a man named Nicholas Morgan, known as Nicky. But whilst they were there, the men got into an argument. Brian grabbed a hammer and attacked Nicky, hitting him over the head. Fueled by alcohol, Brian kept hitting Nicky until he died from his injuries. He then went to a local petrol station, put some petrol in a can, and came back to the house. He poured the fuel over Nicky's body before setting it alight. He stole £1,000 in cash from his brother's home, changed into some of his brother's clothes, and then jumped over the garden fence to make his escape. What he didn't realise is that his brother Glenn, who was also intoxicated, had fallen asleep inside the house. The house went up in smoke, and tragically, Glenn died in the blaze. Brian made his way to Sawnsea train station, where he attempted to make an escape. But his need to drink alcohol brought him to the local pub. He made up a story and told the locals that gypsies had set fire to his brother's house and confirmed that his brother had died in the fire. By this time, the police and fire brigade had been sent to the property by neighbours who saw the fire, and that's where they found the bodies of Nicholas Morgan and Glenn Whitelock. The police discovered that Brian had been in the house just hours before. The arresting officers found him in a pub later that same day, and he was arrested. When the police took him in for questioning, they also took his clothes in for forensic testing. Though he had changed his clothes, the police still found evidence of Nicky's blood on him. He denied any involvement to the police, telling them that he'd gone out poaching earlier in the day and then to the pub. But because Brian had told people in the pub that his brother had died in the blaze before the bodies had been identified, they knew that he was lying. His trial started in the summer of 2001, and he denied both charges. But a jury found him guilty of the murder of Nicholas Morgan and the manslaughter of his brother Glenn Whitelock. He was sentenced to life in prison for murder, with an additional 10 years for manslaughter. But Brian became eligible for parole in 2018. Nicholas Morgan's family started a petition to try to stop him from being released back into their hometown of Sawnsea. On the petition, they wrote, quote, "Brian has served 18 years and is now being prepared for early release into the town that he committed the murders. We as a family want for him not to be allowed in Sawnsea. It's not fair that we won't be able to walk the streets without worrying that we're going to bump into him. We need as many signatures as possible to try and prevent him from being allowed to come to Sawnsea." Brian was released in January 2019, having served just 18 years for the double killing. In a report that was produced by the parole board, it said that Brian had, quote, "taken full responsibility for his behaviour in the community, and he should have sought support sooner." The parole board believed that he had recognised that his drug and alcohol addictions caused him to behave badly. His probation officer said that they had a robust plan for his release. Brian would live in a designated accommodation, and there would be limits on what he could do and where he could go. They described him as low risk for committing another serious crime, though it was stated that if he started using drink and drugs again, this risk could increase. Now in his mid-50s, Brian had a chance to live again. He would remain on probation for the rest of his life, but he had a chance to make something of himself. But Brian couldn't resist the lure of drink and drugs, and not long after he was released, he attacked a supermarket worker whilst intoxicated, and he was sent back to prison. During his return to prison, he worked with the drugs and alcohol specialists who he convinced could manage him if he was let out back into the community. So in October 2021, Brian was released again on licence, and he moved into a property in the village of Cladach, just outside of Sawnsea. It's a small village with a population of 7,500 people. When Brian moved in, locals were made aware of his past, and most people chose to avoid him. But there was one woman who wanted to help him have another chance at life. Her name was Wendy Buckley. She lived on the same street as Brian, in Tannacode Road, and the neighbours became friends. Wendy was 71 years old and well liked in her community. She had 2 stepsons and 16 nieces and nephews, all who adored her. But despite having all of those people in her life, she recognised that Brian needed a purpose, so she started to employ him to do odd jobs around her flat. Brian told people that Wendy was like a second mother to him. He knew that she cared for him, and initially he was thankful for the kindness that she showed him. As well as giving him money for the odd jobs that he did, she would buy him food. A relative of Wendy's became concerned that she was doing too much for a man who had taken the lives of 2 people, but she told them that everyone deserves a second chance. Despite the help he received in prison, it wasn't long before Brian was taking drugs and drinking again. In August 2022, his behaviour started to become erratic.
Brian, try and talk to me. All right, take your time, take your time. Where's your phone, mate? Have you got any family I can ring? Take your time, Brian.
He told his neighbour, Paul Jones, that when he took Valium, he, quote, becomes loopy and would go off on one. So when Brian started to show signs of disturbing behaviour, his neighbour called the police and an ambulance. He was afraid that he was taking drugs again. They took Brian to hospital, but he discharged himself. He would often injure himself when he was intoxicated. He had split his head open on a tree after falling. In a police report, one incident describes him as raving on a bridge whilst under the influence of drugs. He even went on to trash his own home. Brian was offered prescription alternative medications to try to calm him down and to get him off the drugs, but he wasn't interested. He continued to buy street drugs, and his behaviour started to get more erratic. And on the 22nd of August 2022, his behaviour would again turn deadly. Wendy Buckley, the woman who had done so much to help Brian, was last seen at 6:50 p.m. CCTV caught her getting out of her car and going into her flat after she'd popped to the shops. CCTV from the shops showed her looking healthy and happy. 45 minutes later, Brian crossed the road, leaving his flat to enter Wendy's. Brian had been drinking and taking Valium. What happened next can only be described as a sickening and brutal attack on a vulnerable old woman. Brian used a knife, a wooden table leg, and MDF shelves to beat Wendy and stab her. He then removed her clothes and his clothes and violated her body. Neighbours had become concerned when they couldn't find Brian, and he had been reported missing. But then a neighbour spotted Brian coming out of Wendy's house. He was covered in blood, wearing just his boxer shorts, and he started walking towards this man. This man calls 999. Brian kept trying to come near to this man. His neighbour is asking him to get away from him, and the police quickly arrive on the scene. They discover Wendy's body inside her home. Her injuries were catastrophic. The pathologist identified 70 different injuries to her body. Part of Wendy's skull was exposed. The whites of her eyes were bleeding. Her right leg was broken, and her cheekbone had been fractured 3 times.
Oh my God. What have I done?
Splinters from the weapons he had used were embedded in her body. He had also skinned parts of her. He had stripped her naked, and traces of his semen were found near her genitals. He had then piled clothes and objects on top of her body, as if to hide her. When the forensic team examined her home, they found pieces of her flesh on the ceiling and on the walls. He had also trashed Wendy's home. Brian told the police that Wendy had begged for her life. The many people who loved Wendy now had to come to terms with what had happened to her. The signs had been there. Brian's descent into volatile behaviour had been witnessed by so many in the weeks leading up to Wendy's murder. Yet, he had been allowed to discharge himself from the hospital. He was knowingly using drugs, something that had proven to have triggered extreme violence in him in the past. Why had he been allowed to do this? Wendy's family were not able to see her in the morgue because her injuries had meant that the Wendy they knew and loved didn't look anything like her anymore. They weren't able to hold her hand or kiss her goodbye. Wendy's funeral was held in September 2021, and the turnout showed just how loved she was. But there was another family reliving pain at this time too. The family of Nicholas Morgan, the first man that Brian had murdered. Nicky's sister Melanie said that releasing him was a catastrophic mistake, and now another family were mourning like they were, because of the same man.
He obviously wasn't rehabilitated. He'd spent 18 years, whatever resources, and it had all just got washed on the pan as soon as he got back into the drink and drugs.
Brian Whitelock pled not guilty to murdering Wendy Buckley until the first day of his trial, where he pled guilty to manslaughter. But after just half an hour, the jury found him guilty of murder. As the jury announced their verdict, Brian stood up and shouted at them that they hoped they suffered a brain injury and that they were bang out of order for finding him guilty. Mr. Justice Griffiths said this at Brian's sentencing.
Every murder is a tragedy, but the murder of Wendy Buckley was particularly senseless. She was a person about whom even you had nothing but good words to say. In 2000, you murdered Nicholas Morgan in circumstances which had similarities with the murder of Wendy Buckley, of which you have now been convicted after a trial. You had taken Valium, and the effects of this were increased by alcohol. Under the influence of these intoxicants, you savagely and repeatedly attacked him with a blunt instrument in the small hours of the morning, causing numerous skull and face fractures. Witnesses described you as mumbling and babbling, speaking rubbish. This was very similar to your presentation after the murder of Wendy Buckley, which was also committed under the influence of drugs and alcohol.
Brian Whitelock will never be a free man again and will die in prison. When this was read out in court, the members of the public burst into applause. Wendy Buckley was described by her sister Anne as, quote, someone who would give you her last penny. She was a talented horse riding instructor. Wendy was very much loved as a sister and an auntie. Her kindness, laughter and spirit touched the lives of so many. She said, our lives will never be the same without her, but we will continue to honour her memory every day. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to subscribe for weekly true crime videos like these. You're watching Totally True Crime.